We're here at the Peterson Wildlife Refuge as our first extra continues, and I'm joined by Susan Love with the Delaware Coastal Programs, a part of the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control. And Susan, we're glad to have you as first person this week. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You've kind of been on the front lines of this issue of sea level rise here in Delaware, and it's there's sort of a two-pronged impact in Delaware. The sea level is rising, but also the landmass is sort of sinking. Is that right?
That's true, yes. So in Delaware, our local rate of sea level rise is about double the average global rate, and that is because we have the average global rate of sea level rise occurring right here on the Christina River, on the Delaware River, in the Delaware Bay, and on the Atlantic Ocean. But the land surface is actually sinking as a result of the last ice age. So when the ice sheets receded, it actually caused our land mass to start sinking, and the land mass up in New York, New Hampshire to rise a little bit.
And there's some dispute over how much Delaware's landmass is actually sinking in relation to sea level rise.
Well, we don't have as good of data as we'd like to have really for anything, because this is an emerging issue that we're looking into. We're looking into having some better data on the subsidence or sinking rate, while we're also looking at better ways to track and monitor how much the sea is actually rising as well. So that's one of the things we're really trying to work on in the state of Delaware.
And this is an issue up and down the state, sea level rise. And a lot of people are talking about it. We're talking about it now in a big part because of Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, and the impact that had. Was that sort of a good wake-up call, or sort of a mixed bag because it got us off course of sea level rise itself?
No, I don't like calling any storm a wake-up call, because we always want to be prepared for all of these storms that are coming our way, whether it's a hurricane, whether it's a superstorm, or whether it's a nor'easter. And most people don't understand that in Delaware, our flooding risk and our big storms really normally happen as a result of nor'easters, which can last several days and really have a significant impact on tidal flooding and erosion on the beach. And we want to be prepared for all of them. And each storm is really an opportunity maybe to talk more about the long-term ramifications of increased sea level rise and storms, because as the seas rise, when we get the same kind of storm year after year, the damage and the flooding will be worse, because the average tide level is going to incrementally encroach onto land. And so people will start seeing their houses flood or infrastructure flood that may not have flooded before. And it is very serious. So Superstorm Sandy did sort of alert a lot of people to some very serious flooding issues that maybe they hadn't considered before.
And as far as sea level rise goes, what is the impact in Delaware over the next 100 years? I know it's sort of hard to quantify because there's a lot of variables, but it's not just a problem at Rehoboth Beach. There'll be impacts here in Wilmington, where we are right now.
Sure, and that's one of the very important things to understand about sea level rise, particularly in a state like Delaware. We've done some very basic modeling of the impact that sea level rise can have, with a rise of between 1.5 feet and 4.9 feet in the state. And it shows that we will have direct impacts in 31 of our 57 municipalities and all 3 of our counties. Delaware only has 3 counties, but we'll see impacts in all of them. And it's critical that people understand this, because even if you're not within one of those 31 municipalities, you will be affected by this in some way, shape, or form, because the state has conducted a very significant vulnerability assessment. And we looked at all of these things, and we actually quantified the impact that could happen from sea level rise. And we're looking at up to 17,000 homes that could be impacted, 11% of the state's landmass, significant transportation corridors that could be flooded permanently by this. And so even if you're way up in the highlands of Delaware, which is around 450 feet above sea level, you will still see an impact, because you may not be able to drive where you used to be able to drive. You may not be able to ride Amtrak in the Northeast Corridor in certain locations. Prices may go up. Services and goods may not be as available as they once were, and the economy could certainly suffer. And all of the impacts are may require some fixes, particularly in urban areas, and it could have a significant economic cost to the state.
certainly with the loss of all the tourism revenue at the beaches, it being a big part of that economic impact as well.
There's that, but the state has actually been preparing for sea level rise for 40 or more years. The state has a very successful and long-running beach replenishment program where we put sand on the beaches, not only at the ocean, but also on our bay beaches, which is a little bit unusual in the mid-Atlantic region. And so that has really helped prepare those communities for the impacts of sea level rise. And in addition, the state, since the early 1970s, as a result of the Coastal Zone Act, which Russ Peterson helped funnel through when he was governor, helped the state really set aside acres, hundreds of thousands of acres of land as permanently conserved. And so we have very low population density in a vast expanse of our state, which helps us long-term minimize our population's vulnerability to sea level rise. But we still have a lot of work to do, even though those things have been ongoing.
So what is sort of the answer? And I know it's not just one answer. That's the loaded question. Right. Pumping sand, adding more beach. Do we become Netherlands with the dikes, or like New Orleans? What can we do over the next century to sort of mitigate some of these impacts?
There's a lot of things that we can do, and the solutions are going to be very localized. What works for Bethany Beach in Delaware is not going to work for Southbridge, Wilmington, and what works for Delaware City is not going to work for Newcastle City. And so one of the things that we're starting to do is work with the local governments on resiliency plans or preparedness plans so that they can begin to look at their building and zoning codes, their protection mechanisms, their drainage codes, the way that water moves in and out. And we're encouraging people to start planning further ahead than maybe 10 or 20 years, but really look at what the tide levels will be in the lifespan of what you're looking to build or do. And so the Department of Transportation is starting to take a look at this and look at what the tide levels might be 20, 30, 40 years from now instead of just what they are currently today. So I work with an advisory committee of 24 members. It's a statewide committee, and we have come up with about 60 options for the state to prepare. And there's many, many more. And these are really policy, data gathering kind of options. And this is just the beginning. This is going to be our roadmap to preparing for sea level rise in the state. And it'll help get some of those projects on the ground that may be beach replenishment, maybe dikes, maybe seawalls, or maybe wetland restoration projects.
And finally, there's a lot of people who don't really buy into the fact that sea level is rising or will rise. What's your message to those people? How do you convince them, or can you? Is it necessary to convince people who don't really believe that this sea level will rise as you projected it to rise?
So there's two things there. The sea levels are rising in the state right now. Our current rate of sea level rise is about 13 inches every 100 years. So sea levels are rising, they're rising today. We predict that that level of rise will accelerate or increase in the future. But you can still prepare for sea level rise, even if you only prepare for that existing rate. But there are climate change skeptics, for sure, and to them, our message has really been that by preparing for sea level rise long term, by really thinking about what's happening 50, 60, 80 years out, if we prepare for that, we'll do a better job of preparing for tomorrow's storm that might come up, rather than trying to prepare for the storms that are happening and missing out on that long-term proactive planning. And that's a message that actually resonates with Delawareans. We conducted a survey several years ago and found that there's very high, in the 70 or 80% of the people surveyed, think that proactive planning should happen to address sea level rise before impacts start occurring. But I would say that we're already seeing those impacts occur in Delaware, and so we're ready to start preparing for it.
All right, Susan, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Susan Love, a planner with Delaware Coastal Programs within the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control.